Hi, I'm Tracey with Worley and Associates and the Lightfoot Youngblood team. Today, we are going to talk about why an attorney is an important part of your power team. Today, I am talking with Cody Fenton with Fenton Grimwood Attorney at Law here in Branson, Missouri. I want to welcome Cody for taking your time out of your morning to come in and talk with me.
Absolutely.
And also to help assist and educate our investors who may be watching this video.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about how your firm could best assist, somebody who's going to have that primary focus in investing, possibly even partnerships.
Cody Fenton with Fenton Grimwood here in Branson. Our office has been open for about 4 years. I've been practicing law in Branson for almost 8 years now. Originally starting out, my background is actually real estate litigation. So I have a strong background in real estate law. Did a lot of work with homeowners associations, things like that. But a few years ago, had an opportunity to kind of focus on some different areas, something I was kind of more passionate about, and that was estate planning. And then incorporating that and working with business owners and doing business formation. So now anymore, I primarily focus on estate planning, probate work, and then business related like formation, business transactions, things like that. When it comes to particularly a new real estate investor, right? They've probably got a lot of questions. They've got a lot of questions for you. It's kind of this whole new world they're exploring, in addition to working with the realtor. My office or any law firm that does the kind of work we do can assist with, the legal side of things and making sure that person is protected and kind of setting it up, correctly as they dive into this new adventure, right? So.
Yeah, for sure. I always like to talk about my personal experience as well, because I feel that why reinvent the wheel, right? Especially when you're a new real estate investor, because we all make mistakes along the way. And that's how we learn and grow and become better and be successful.
Sure.
So, one of the things that I did was I purchased 5 properties, and I had my CPA at the time create an LLC for me, which at that time was most likely what the CPA, when they created the LLC, what they felt was best for me in the long run, because I did have an employee involved. But now that I am starting to purchase more property,
right,
the way that LLC was set up wasn't necessarily going to be the best for my future longevity wise in my business plan. So I personally, for myself, feel that had I started with an attorney the first go around and had maybe at that point you speak with my CPA, that you guys could have come together on my behalf and created something that was going to be a little bit better, because you could have said, well, in the future, this is her plan here too.
Sure. And that's the thing, it's 2 different angles, right? You've got the CPA who's looking at it from a tax side of things, an accounting side of things. And of course that's important. And we always work with CPAs and accountants and people on those things. But what's overlooked on that side, and where my viewpoint or an attorney's viewpoint can be helpful, is, sometimes there's other considerations other than just taxes, right? Maybe there's some estate planning considerations. Maybe there's, if the owner of the LLC passes away, and then that's going to be transferred to the next generation or wherever they want it to transfer to. As we've seen, right, depending on how that's set up initially, that can have a big impact on the back end of things. And so really the best way to do it, because I'm not a tax attorney, right? And so, I know my limits, and the accountants, they have, kind of their lane, I have my lane, and really where it starts to benefit everybody and where it works best is when those 2 work together to say, okay, well, let's make sure we are covering the best possible tax situation, but then let's also make sure that legally, right, we're forming it correctly, because that's a big deal. We want it to be formed correctly and operated correctly. And that's where, somebody like me can assist. But then also we want to think about, long term, what does this look like from an estate planning standpoint? Is this going to be, is it going to be a real estate holding type company that's going to transfer to kids or or down the line, right? And so how do we do that
Mm-hmm.
and take advantage of, some of the tax laws and the tax code and the situations there to do it in the most advantageous way possible. So.
That sounds probably very complicated to a new investor who's
Sure.
going to be coming in. And I want to assure you that it's not.
Sure.
Because that's why we hire professionals and have you guys on our power team, because you guys are the brain behind that piece. You are thinking of all of those things for us. So, for example, I went in to see Cody and I said, I'm buying more property. I have this scenario. What are we going to do? We kind of looked at my future, the way things are set up, what my investment goals and plans are, and we put a plan in place. We created some other LLCs.
Sure.
We have a plan in place to, correct the things. I have a CPA on my power team as well, and that CPA was able to collaborate directly with Cody, and they both knew what my goals are, what my needs are, and they were able to put a plan together in place. And then we discussed it and executed it.
Sure.
And it was as simple as that. So it took all of that brain work for mine of saying, well, gosh, am I setting this up right?
Sure.
Do I need to do this? Do I need to do that? Because, some folks will go online and create an LLC.
Yeah.
And that's fine and dandy. But at the end of the day, there may be some protection in there that didn't happen.
Well, and I think, a common pitfall we see with folks that either have created LLCs, that, Missouri, and I can only speak to Missouri because I'm only licensed in Missouri presently, but Missouri, for better or worse, the system to create an LLC, the actual formation of it with the Missouri Secretary of State's office is fairly simple. And really within about 10 minutes and a credit card, you can have an LLC formed, right? You can put in all the information and they'll send you back your articles of organization as being filed, and they'll issue something called a certificate of organization. Well, if you stop there, you think, well, I've got an LLC, right? Yeah. This is all set up. The problem is, and this is the part that's overlooked, and we see this time and time and time again, is Missouri statute, in addition to the filing of the articles with the Secretary of State, obtaining the certificate of organization, Chapter 347 of the Missouri statutes governs limited liability companies. And it also requires that you create an operating agreement. And so what we found is people either overlook that step and don't realize that, or worse, they Google an operating agreement and pull a document offline. And not to suggest that it can't be done, but you have to be very careful, because every state has its own specific laws, right? And owns specific sort of parameters within which you have to operate that LLC. And so if you're pulling a document, say even from Arkansas, which is 13 miles away from us, it could be the case that the majority of that would work and the majority of that's okay, but you're going to miss out on some key statutory points that need to be included in the operating agreement specific to Missouri law. Mm-hmm. And so that's really where, for somebody that's starting out and getting into this, and they've never had an LLC, they're trying to figure out, do I even need an LLC? I guess it would help to understand. So the LLC is a limited liability company, right? And the reason we want to set that up, and the reason you want to have that is, when you're buying investment property or property that's going to be used for non-personal use, right? Or primarily used for non-personal use. So nightly rental, short-term rental, even long-term rental, right? Mm-hmm. Anytime you're doing something like that, that's more of a business use. Mm-hmm. And we want to separate that from our personal assets, right? Mm-hmm. And so the limited liability company, or the LLC, provides us that limited liability. So anybody that's over here dealing with the business side of things, if there's an issue, then we're limiting our liability just to that LLC and that business, right? We're not subjecting our personal residence and our vehicles and our bank accounts and everything else we have over here. We're kind of separating it out. And so, it's important to have that, but in addition, it's important to ensure that it's set up correctly, right? Because if you don't file it correctly, if you don't have the operating agreement, if you don't maintain a registered agent in the state of Missouri, if you don't do certain things, keep a separate accounting, right? I mean, there's sort of all these things that are kind of required, and it's not difficult, but it's just stuff that you have to, be made aware of if you've never done it before. The situation they can find themselves in is they set it up maybe partially correct, or they set it up and it's correct, but they're not using it correctly. And that's what working with an attorney, somebody like myself, we can sit down, we can discuss the situation, we can discuss, what this person's looking to do, and then basically advise them, what do we think is best for that situation. And then if they're working with an accountant, we would of course incorporate a conversation with their accountant into that discussion. If they're not working with an accountant, which they should be, right? Yeah. But if they're not, then we of course have those contacts and those resources. My accountant is always helpful with answering questions for my clients, if they don't have somebody. And so it gets us started on the right path to ensure that if somebody's jumping into this, which is an exciting thing, right? And it's a super exciting thing, and as we've seen over the years, it's a great opportunity. You know that better than I do, right? It's a huge opportunity for people, but they just want to make sure they're doing those little things on the front end, and what really amounts to relatively low cost, right? I mean, if you look big picture, some of these initial steps are relatively low cost compared to what it could cost somebody on the back end.
So I have clients that are out of state. Majority of them, Branson, Missouri is a tourist destination. Sure. A lot of folks will buy a property to use here when they're in town and for their family or even friends. But when they're not in the property, they're renting it out to pay for itself. Or in most cases, rate of return is the key factor, and it's an investment property for them. Right. So the question always is, well, can I go ahead and put these in my LLC that is in another state? Maybe they're from Washington or Florida or Chicago, Illinois or Arkansas or something. Sure. So, what can they do?
Yeah, so the general answer to that question is yes. Missouri allows for the registration of what it calls a foreign entity. And so if you've got somebody that say they live in Florida, for instance, and they've got a Florida LLC already, then yes, absolutely, they can register that entity in the state of Missouri with the Secretary of State, establish a registered office here, and that registered office can either be an attorney. There's third-party companies that just charge a fee for this service. They can use the property address as the registered address. I mean, there's a number of ways to accomplish that, but you have to have a physical location in the state of Missouri, and you register that business here, and it can conduct business in the state of Missouri and own Missouri property. Now, kind of the more difficult analysis that would have to be determined is it better? It depends on what else that LLC is doing, right? And you and I have talked before about sometimes we want to limit the limited liability company, right? So say you've got somebody that is buying multiple properties. There may be a reason, and there may be a good reason to say, well, we've got this Florida LLC that owns maybe a Florida condo, and we're wanting to buy a Missouri condo. When you compare the cost of setting up the Missouri LLC, it's a relatively low cost, but the benefit of splitting those two out and saying, well, let's keep the Florida LLC limited to the Florida condo, and let's create a Missouri LLC for the Missouri condo. What that does is it separates the liability between those two. So if somebody gets hurt or injured at the Florida property, or there's an issue at the Florida property, well, now the Missouri property is not subject to liability. The liability for an LLC is limited to the extent of its assets. So the more assets we put into that LLC, the more exposure there is, if you will. And so when it comes to real estate in particular, what we have a lot of people do, and a lot of my clients do this, as they venture more into this and acquire more properties, what you start to see is, well, we're going to create, LLC A and put one property in it. We're going to create LLC B and put the next property in it. And it's just kind of on down the line. I've got clients that have 15 different LLCs, and each one owns a separate property. And what you're doing when you do that is you're splitting out the liability, and you're saying, well, if something happens over here, I only want to be liable over here and not subject all my other assets to that. So you're actually limiting your personal assets and your business assets. So the answer to the question is yes, a foreign entity can be registered in the state of Missouri, can conduct business in the state of Missouri. That's perfectly fine. Sometimes whether we do that or not is a question that we just kind of have to look at after talking with the client about their specific situation.
One other thing that I want to talk about, which you touched a little bit on a couple of different times, is a registered agent. So there are a lot of new investors that are coming into our market they have an LLC set up or they're setting up an LLC. And when they go to register at the Secretary of State level, and sure. Mind you, like I said, this sounds like a lot of steps, but when you have an attorney on your side, they take care of all of that for
right.
you. They make sure it's all set up, it's all registered, it's all filed.
Sure, right.
All you have to do is, and there's actually a step-by-step of, hey, this is what you got to do from here.
Right.
My CPA, for example, I have my LLC and all my documents. Now I've handed that to my CPA and they make sure my taxes are paid. Right. So
yeah, magically, right?
It just magically happens. But a registered agent, let's talk about that just a little bit, because if you don't reside in the state of Missouri, then you need a registered agent, or even if you do, because, for example,
don't want to be served, right?
Yeah.
So Missouri statute requires when you're forming the LLC, you've got to have a registered office, okay? And that's required for purposes of service of process primarily, or for service through the Secretary of State. And so what's required is that you have to have a physical address in the state of Missouri. So if you can bring in an LLC from Florida, that's fine, as long as there's a physical address here for purposes of the registered agent. And so a lot of folks, like at my office, we almost always serve as the registered agent unless somebody tells us they don't want us to. And I'll get to why that can also be helpful for other reasons. But so an attorney can be a registered agent. Like I mentioned earlier, there's third-party companies. You can pay them, an annual fee, generally somewhere in the neighborhood of $100, $150, something like that. And they'll be your registered agent. Folks that are buying real estate, they can use the address of the real property for purposes of registered agent. But, and here's why, utilizing an attorney or a third-party company can be more advantageous, or maybe why you don't want your real property to be the registered address. If somebody sues you, the service of that lawsuit typically occurs through the registered agent if they're suing a business. And so, you don't want to have a tenant, a nightly renter at your property, and then a process server or the sheriff knocking on the door trying to serve you, right?
That would be horrible.
That would be really bad. And so a lot of people, for privacy reasons, for those reasons, they just want it to be an attorney or some third-party company to be that registered office, so that they don't have to worry about those issues. Now, hopefully people aren't getting sued, but it does happen, right? And in fact, I was telling you the other day about, I was actually served on behalf of a client while I was teaching. And so it happens. You never know where it's going to happen, and those folks are they can get creative on where they want to serve you.
Sure.
And so when it comes to a business, protecting your privacy and your personal information, it can be a good thing. And so by setting up a registered agent that's your attorney, or this third party type company that offers that service can for relatively low cost, pretty minimal cost, can be a good thing.
I cannot thank you enough again for
My
coming
pleasure.
in. Cody is a wealth of knowledge. I am so happy to have you part of my power team. For anybody who's watching, we will make sure that Cody's web address is below so that you can reach out to Cody at any time. And then if they wanted to reach out and call you, how can they do that?
Yeah, sure. So of course, all our contact information, address, everything's on our website. Our phone number is 417-335-3550.
Thank you for tuning in with us today. You can always reach me, Tracey Lightfoot at Worley & Associates and Lightfoot Youngblood team at bransonhomefinder.com. And we look forward to working with you.